This is True Crime Out Loud.
I'm your host, B.
And I'm your host, Jen. We watched a documentary that gave us a lot of our information on this case this week. It's called Above Suspicion, The Fifth Estate on CBC News. And we found it on YouTube. It is great to watch to go along with this.
Yeah, it provides a lot of information on this very interesting case. And the case is going to take place in 3 different locations. And per the usual, I'm going to give you basic information on each place. And then I'll kind of tell you how they factor into the case later on. The first place is Tweed, Ontario, Canada, and it's a town of about 1,800 people serviced by the Ontario Provincial Police. The second location is going to be Orleans, like New Orleans, but Orleans. It's a suburb of Ottawa, also located in Ontario, Canada, with a population of about 116,000. Located about 10 miles or 16 kilometers on the metric system, which they are in Canada, from downtown Ottawa. The third and final location is Brighton, which is also located in Ontario, Canada. It's located in Northumberland County and has a population of about 11,800.
The case begins in 2007 when there was a series of break-ins in the Tweed and Belleville area. Now, Belleville is located near Tweed. Starting in May of 2008, there were similar crimes in Orleans area. There were about 15 to 25 burglaries and thefts in Orleans. And then Tweed to Orleans is about a 2.5-hour drive, but there were some very similar break-ins. The homes were usually entered at night when no one was home. Sometimes the same home was hit more than once. In some instances, there were no signs of forced entry, and other times there were cut screens or a window was forced open and possibly locks being picked. Now, most of the Tweed victims did not report the crimes because they didn't realize that someone had been in their home. On one victim's computer, there was a cryptic message of merci, and merci is thank you in French. In September of 2009, there were 2 home invasions. They were sexual assaults on women, and these occurred in Tweed. One woman was sexually assaulted and tied up in her home. And then another woman is sexually assaulted in Tweed on Cozy Cove Lane, which will become important later. One victim was on her couch, and she was stripped naked with a knife used to cut her clothes off, sexually assaulted, and ordered to pose for pictures. On November 25th of 2009, a 38-year-old woman who lived alone in Brighton was found dead in her home. She was identified as Corporal Marie France Como, and she was a military flight attendant who worked at the Canadian Forces Base in Trenton. And this CFB, Canadian Forces Base, is near Brighton. Now, this was initially thought to be a suicide, but pretty quickly they determined, nope, we've got a homicide. Her autopsy showed that she died of asphyxiation, but she also had 5 blows to her head. A few months later, on January 28, 2010, a 27-year-old woman who lived alone came home after a night out and sent a goodnight text to her friend at 10:36 p.m. It said something along the lines of night-night or good night. But the next day, she didn't show up for work. Her name was Jessica Lloyd. Now, she worked for a school bus service company, and she was located in Tweed. That afternoon, her mother contacted her brother and said, I can't get in touch with Jessica. She didn't show up at work. Will you go check on her? So the brother goes to check on Jessica. He found her purse, her ID, her cell phone, but no Jessica. Police start to investigate, and they even do helicopter searches, but no finding Jessica.
So police are beginning this investigation on the disappearance of Jessica Lloyd when they pretty immediately get a huge break. A motorist passing by Jessica's home saw the police cars out there and said, "Hey, I've got information. I bet, they're looking for her." The motorist told police that about 3 a.m. that day, he and his cousin were taking a load of, we weren't able to determine, but a truckload of stuff to drop off when he saw an SUV parked in the field near Jessica's home. He noted the time in his mind because it was in an odd place at an odd time, and the only home really close to the field was Jessica's. He told police where the SUV was parked and where they would be able to find the tire tracks. And they did. They went out there and they located those tire tracks, and they were exactly where the witness, Lyle Barker, said they would be. They also continued to examine the area and located some boot prints around Jessica's home. And we got to remember, for listeners who may live in the South, like us, it had not snowed since Jessica went missing. And because it was so cold, the ground had preserved the prints. They have a lot of problems up north with footprints being covered up with snow and that kind of thing. Not something we really deal with in the South. But this turned out to be a huge lead for investigators because they were able to get the vehicle tracks and the boot prints from the property around Jessica's home. A week after her disappearance, on February 4th, police set up a roadblock on Highway 37, which is going to be a major thoroughfare near Jessica's home. It actually connects Belleville and Tweed. They stopped every vehicle that came through there, police checkpoint, stopped every vehicle and looked at the tires to see if the tires could possibly be like the tires that were in Jessica's yard, basically, in the field near her home. One of the vehicles that they stopped was a Nissan Pathfinder, and that vehicle was being driven by Colonel Russell Williams, and he was the commander at the Canadian Forces Base at Toronto. The police who were checking this noticed that the Pathfinder's tires looked very similar, so he was definitely someone that police wanted to talk to, but that night they just kind of looked at his tires, identified him, and let him go. So they got a name, right? Colonel Russell Williams. And on Sunday, February 7th, they call him. The Ontario Provincial Police call Colonel Russell Williams and ask him to come to the station and give them a statement. He agreed and told his wife that he would be home for dinner. This is kind of unusual because it's taking place on a Sunday. This indicates to me that the police, obviously, it was like an exigent thing. They wanted to get this guy's story on paper quick. So he meets with Detective Sergeant Smith. And, of course, he denies any involvement in the murder of Jessica or Corporal Como. Smith tells Williams that he is connected by proximity to 4 cases, 2 sexual assaults and 2 murders. He reads Colonel Williams his rights, and Colonel Williams willingly waives his rights. He provides fingerprints and blood samples, and investigators took his shoes to compare to the boot prints that they found in Jessica's field. Colonel Williams was calm, confident, and chewing gum, which may not sound important, but, it kind of shows that he's relaxed. He's not overly nervous, that kind of thing. Now, he asked Sergeant Smith to be discreet about the questioning of him because of his position, and he didn't want to bring any kind of dishonor to the Canadian Armed Forces, and he is a prominent person. Like I said, he's not middle management on this base. He is the commander for the base. That's a big thing. It's a large base. So Detective Smith says, okay, I got it. That's what we're going to do, but I'm going to lay out the case that we have against you. And they have a tire track, and it's currently being compared to the Nissan Pathfinder. They have a boot print that they're now comparing to the boots that he was wearing when he came in for the interview. Smith goes ahead and tells Williams, hey, look, I have not had this forensically analyzed yet. We're working on that, but I can look at it and tell that they're a match. Smith said that they know that Williams drove the Pathfinder to Jessica's home, and they know that he walked up to the back of her house. Smith tells him that they're going to search his home and his vehicles. Williams' biggest concern was for his wife. He did not want her to have any embarrassment and was concerned how she would feel about the police executing a search warrant at their brand new home. Lucky for police and unlucky for Williams, the day he was stopped at the roadblock, like I said, he was driving that Pathfinder. That's not what he usually drove. He usually drove a BMW. He just happened to be in the Pathfinder when he comes through the police roadblock. About an hour and a half into the interview, he admits that he killed Jessica Lloyd. And we've given you kind of a brief rundown of the confession and the nature of the interview and everything. But as all the True Crime Out Loud listeners know, Jen and I have a background in law enforcement, and some of that for me was in investigations. And this interview is textbook. I mean, it's incredible. It starts out with someone who is compliant and adamant that they didn't do anything. And over the course of an hour and a half, this detective just breaks him down. And he had some good evidence to help do that, but he also employed very good use of some investigative techniques. So Williams is going to explain. He has admitted to killing Jessica Lloyd, and obviously police want to know the circumstances about it. He showed no emotions when he talked of her murder, and he spoke in a monotone voice. He said he didn't know Jessica, but she lived close by his Tweed home. He said that he had driven by her house and saw her working out on her treadmill and thought she was cute. He broke into her home the next night while she was sleeping, and he claimed that he beat her and bound her and put duct tape over her eyes. He stated that he put a zip tie around her neck and said he would tighten it if he didn't like what she was doing. He said that he set up a video camera and raped her for hours while stopping to take pictures. Now, Williams tells Sergeant Smith that he spent about 3 hours in her home. He put her in his vehicle and took her to his house just down the street on Cozy Cove Lane. Once at his home, he made her take a shower and then let her sleep for a few hours before setting the video camera up again and raping her for hours. He told police that at one point she had a seizure but recovered. He instructed her to put on some of her underwear that he had taken from her home, and then he took some more pictures of her in her underwear. He told her she would get to go home, but as they were leaving, he struck her in the head with his flashlight to knock her out and then strangled her to death with a rope. He told police that she had begged for her life and that he had killed her to cover his trail. He felt like he would get caught if she survived. He wrapped her body in a blanket and left her in the garage because it was cold, and he went to work that evening. That was Friday evening, and completed a flight on Saturday. He spent the weekend with his wife at their new home in Ottawa and returned to the Tweed home on Tuesday, February 2nd around midnight, when he took her body to a wooded area not far from the home and left her behind a large rock that was in the area. A little bit about Jessica. She lived in the home where she had grown up, and her father, who died in 1996, was also a Canadian Forces officer with 25 years of service. But that wasn't the end. He confessed to also killing Corporal Marie France Como. He said that he had been on a flight with her before, and they both worked at the same air base. He knew that she had lived alone with just her and her 2 cats. The first time he entered her home, he took pictures of himself in her underwear. He went back a week later and hid in her basement and was going to wait for her to go to sleep. He told police that he had been in the basement about 30 minutes when she got home, and she came to the basement searching out one of her cats, and she saw him. He stated that he hit her with a flashlight to knock her out, and she struggled, and he actually tied her to a pole in the basement. He said that he bound her and covered her mouth with duct tape, took pictures, and then took her to her bedroom, where he set up a video camera and repeated the same thing that he did with Miss Lloyd. He repeatedly raped her and took pictures. Her sexual assault lasted nearly 2 hours. He claimed that during this time she begged for life several times and said, "Have a heart, please. I've been good all my life. I don't want to die. I want to live so badly." And he just responded by telling her to shut up. He told police that she was very aggressive and fought him. He planned to strangle her, but she struggled so hard that he decided on a different method. He put duct tape over her nose and mouth, and she eventually suffocated to death. He took pictures of her as she was struggling to try to breathe, and also took pictures of her after she died. He then tried to clean the area up with bleach, placed her on the bed, and left with some of her underwear. He got himself cleaned up and then carried on about his business, went to Ottawa for a meeting. A few days after Corporal Como's death, Because of his position as the base commander, he actually wrote a letter of condolence to her father. He told police that he thought about letting Corporal Como live, but was fearful that police would connect the crimes in Tweed to him because of his military connection to Como.
But that's not all. He kills Corporal Como in November, and then in January he kills Jessica. After killing Corporal Como, he didn't commit any crimes for about 2 months when he killed Jessica. But the confession doesn't end here. In fact, it was a nearly 10-hour confession. I would recommend you go on YouTube and find this. You're not going to see the full 10 hours. The ones I have found are broken up into parts, and it's usually about a 2 to 2.5 hours. But the first part of it is what's really interesting. But he tells them, well, my crimes actually started in 2007, and they lasted until I was called in 2010. He said he started by going to homes where he knew no one was home. The first crime was when he broke into a home a few houses down from his Tweed home on Cozy Cove Lane. He knew these people. They had dinner together. They had gone fishing together. He broke into this same home 3 times. He took a picture of himself lying naked on the bed of their 12-year-old daughter and masturbating while wearing red panties that were believed to belong to the daughter. He took 14 pictures that night in the undergarments, and you can see his penis protruding from the girl's underwear. From 2007 until 2010, he would break into homes, dress up in the women's or girls' undergarments, and masturbate while in the clothing, and then would steal their lingerie. He took photos of female undergarments, panties, bras, etc., and they were either spread out on the bed or the floor. He was taking these undergarments and underwear as his trophies. Now, the youngest of these girls that he stole underwear from is believed to be about 9 years old. He didn't prefer just children. It was all age range of women. First, he would photograph the bedroom of the victim, and then he would take pictures of their undergarments in the drawer. And then he would remove the undergarments from the drawer and neatly lay them out on the bed or the floor and photograph them. And then he would put on and model the underwear, also taking pictures of himself. Then he would masturbate and ejaculate. But he was careful. He didn't want to leave any evidence behind. So from September of 2007 to November of 2009, he committed 82 break-ins in a total of 48 homes. Like we said earlier, he went back to many of the homes more than one time. In July of 2009, he said that he hid outside a neighbor's house in Tweed and waited for the woman to get in the shower. At about 1:30 a.m., when she got in the shower, he stripped naked, broke into the home, and went to her bedroom where he stole her underwear. Another instance, he waited outside the window of a teenage girl's bedroom and watched her undress while he stripped naked and masturbated. But he said by September of 2009, he wasn't getting enough stimulation and he needed something more. So on September 17th of 2009, he went into the home of a 21-year-old woman in Tweed at about 1 a.m. He was dressed in all black and had his face covered. The woman was sleeping, and he struck her in the head, which caused her to be alerted and wake up. He then hit her a few more times, then bound her hands and covered her face with a pillowcase. He pulled her tank top aside, fondled her breast, photographed her naked, took some lingerie and a baby blanket, then left. Of course, there was sexual assault in that. That woman had been sleeping next to her 8-week-old baby. On September 30th of 2009, he broke into the home of a 46-year-old woman who was sleeping on the couch. He punched her, then he wrapped her in a blanket and tied her up. He blindfolded her, and he stayed with this woman about 3.5 hours. He fondled her breasts, took pictures, used a knife to cut off her clothing, and then took more pictures. Then he went across the street to his house and then went to work. This was the 3rd time he had been in this woman's home, but he didn't know her prior to the assault. He told them he had some folders on his computer of victims and the assaults. He told police he felt a compulsion to steal women's underwear in his 20s and 30s, but he didn't act on it. He said these sexual compulsions of the assaults were a recent development. When asked why he was telling all of this now, he said it was mostly to make his wife's life easier. One victim, Laurie Massicote, and I'm not sure if I said that right, she was the victim of the sexual assault on September 30th. She applied to have the ban on her identity lifted so she could speak publicly about her case. So what evidence do the police have? Well, Williams tells them where they could find Jessica's body. He got a map and pointed on a map to where she was. And police did locate her body off of Cary Road in Tweed. She was bound with duct tape. He told them where the memory cards were that were located that had the recordings and photos on them. We keep talking about his homes, one in Ottawa or Orleans suburb of Ottawa and Tweed. He had the Tweed home, and because of where he worked on the Air Force Base, he stayed at that Tweed home because his Orleans home was 2.5 hours away. So that's why he has these two different homes. But on February of 2010, search warrants of both homes were done along with his office and vehicles. In his main home in Orleans, which he shared with his wife, the new home, they found women's clothing items in the garage and basement. They found a black skull cap in a bag next to his and his wife's bed. In the Tweed home, they found hundreds of women's panties and other undergarments. There were 1,400 pieces of clothing, mostly underwear or lingerie, but also swimsuits, dresses, and even shoes. These photos that were on his computer were in a series of subfolders, so it took some maneuvering to find them, but Williams told them how to get there. And there were thousands of photos. One pose that he would do while wearing the lingerie was to look straight at the camera in this serious military-like stance. And then another one of his favorite poses was turning his back to the camera and then looking back over his shoulder. Many of the pictures were a close-up of his penis, which was covered by him wearing the women's underwear. There were some of him lying on a bed surrounded by stuffed animals and panties of girls, or some with stuffed animals and him wearing lingerie. He kept meticulous records of his crimes and of his trophies. Along with the photos and videos, there were dates, locations, times, and he even measured the distance to some of the scenes. When asked why he did all this, his reply was, "Numbers. That's just the way I am."
So who was this guy, David Russell Williams? Well, he went by Russ to his friends, and he was born on March 7th, 1963 in the Midlands region of England. He moved to Ontario, Canada as a child with his mother and father, where his father took a job at a nuclear research laboratory. His parents split when he was 6 or 7, and his mother remarried Dr. Jerry Savka. He had a brother, Harvey, who is now a medical doctor. Russ began using the last name of Savka, his stepfather's last name, until adulthood. He was raised mainly in Toronto, in the suburb of Scarborough. As he was in his later years of high school, his stepdad, a nuclear engineer, took a job in South Korea, but he didn't move with his mother and stepfather. He stayed in Canada. For the last 2 years of school, he attended a very exclusive boarding school, the Upper Canada College, where he became one of only 2 prefects, which put him in a position of leadership in the boarding facility. He attended the University of Toronto and graduated in 1986 with a degree in economics and political science. His friends from school said that he was a good student, played trumpet in the band, and he was known as a prankster, but really nothing nefarious. He was known by everyone to like structure. People who knew him best say that looking back on his life and behaviors, there was nothing that pointed to what eventually he would do. We don't know much about his social life because he was not one to go out to parties. He mainly kept to himself, but he did have a love of flying, and while in college he took flying lessons. And when he graduated from college in 1986, his friends were stunned when he told them that he wanted to be a pilot. He joined the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1987 and rose up through the ranks, and he had served 23 years in the Air Force at the time of this crime. In 1991, he married Mary Elizabeth Harriman, and while in the Air Force, he earned a master's degree in defense studies from the Royal Military College in Kingston, Ontario in 2004. One of the jobs that he had in the Air Force was as an instructor. At one point, he was the pilot in charge of VIP transports, and this included overseeing flights of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. He eventually got promoted to colonel in the Canadian Air Forces, and in July of 2009, he was sworn in as commander of the 8-Wing Canadian Forces base in Trenton. He was a decorated Air Force pilot with an exemplary service record and had perfect reviews. He did a tour of duty in the Middle East during the War on Terror. Williams and his wife had no children, and she denied any knowledge of his crimes. His only hobbies that he stated were, as an amateur photographer, he liked to fish and run, and he and his wife liked to golf. They had bought the cottage in Tweed in 2004, but they built the home in Orleans shortly before he was arrested. He also had some living accommodations on the base because he was the commander, and that might at times have him staying there. So Tweed to the base is about 45 or 50 minutes away, so he usually stayed at the cottage. His wife stayed in Orleans, which was 2.5 hours away from Tweed, so that's why he wasn't there. He had absolutely no criminal history. His childhood in no way fit the pattern of other sexually motivated killers that we're used to talking about, like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer. His pattern was also different in that he victimized people he knew, neighbors and friends, people that he lived close to. Most other people who commit crimes of this type have ruled those family members and friends as off limits. Although he murdered 2 people, far less than well-known serial killers, he would have most definitely continued killing had he not been caught. But he was caught, and in April of 2010, he was put on suicide watch after attempting suicide by stuffing a cardboard toilet paper roll down his throat in order to asphyxiate himself. But he was discovered by guards before he was successful. In October of 2010, he entered a plea of guilty to all charges, and he was sentenced to 2 life terms with no chance of parole for 25 years for the 2 counts of first-degree murder, 10 years for each of the 2 sexual assaults and forcible containments, and 82 other counts, including 61 burglaries and thefts, 11 attempted burglaries, and 10 burglaries with intent to commit an indictable offense. The Pathfinder was crushed and destroyed after the case, and the day after his conviction, he was stripped of his rank and the Canadian Armed Forces burned his uniform. He was sued by the victims and families involved, and in 2014, he reached a financial settlement with many of them.
Because there's so many, we can't tell you all of these victim stories. But I'm going to go through just a few of them to kind of give you an idea into these crimes. Now, most of these stories we got from that show we mentioned earlier, Above Suspicion, The Fifth Estate. In January of 2009, a family came home from a trip and began unpacking. Their 15-year-old daughter became alarmed and told her parents that all of her underwear was missing. Not just like 1 or 2 pair, all of them. Well, she kept looking around, and it was not only her underwear, but there was dresses, shoes, swimsuit, and someone had gone through the family photo albums and removed pictures of just this girl. So William's neighbor in Tweed was Larry Jones on Cozy Cove Lane. And Larry's adult daughter also lived in the neighborhood. Well, she came home to find a man in jogging clothes in her home. And when she entered, he ran out the back door. Now, she thought it might be neighborhood kids, so she didn't really think too much of it. But she did tell her dad, and her dad did say something to Williams. One of the sexual assaults in September of 2009, the male blindfolded the victim, choked her, tied her up, beat her, cut off her clothes with a knife, photographed her for 2.5 hours, and she said the man's voice sounded familiar and somehow pointed them to Larry Jones, the neighbor of Williams. And Larry had search warrants executed at his home and was obviously on police radar. Well, of course, they didn't find anything in his home, but their feelers are still out there with Larry. So another victim who happened to teach music on the base lived alone in Belleville, which is not very far from Tweed. She came home and saw her bedside table drawers open, and the only thing missing? Her sex toys. Well, she was about to go out for the evening, and her friend was there, and she talked to her friend about calling the police, but they decided against it. She said they thought the police would just laugh because she was reporting the theft of her sex toys, and it seemed that that was all that was missing. So she just let it go, but she decided not to stay there that night and went on out with her friend. So she and her friend check all the windows and doors, and they make sure everything's locked and secured before they leave for that evening. When she came back home the next day, an old computer that she kept in her home office had been turned on. Now, she didn't use this computer anymore, and she knows that she didn't turn it on. And like we said, she lived alone. On the screen, the screensaver had been replaced with the wording, "Go ahead and call the police. I want to show the judge your really big dildos." So she goes to her bedroom where her dresser drawers were now open and all of her underwear was missing. So by all of this, it tells her that the suspect, knowing that they were talking about calling the police but didn't, she feels that he was still in her home when she and her friend were there and listened to their conversation, but he was hiding.
So obviously this guy's a sexual deviant. He has paraphilia, but this usually emerges in the teenage years or 20s. Experts don't feel this was the first time he gave in to desires, but it was things that would stay under the radar, like the taking of underwear from a friend's home. He was obviously very calculated and planned his crimes. He jogged through the neighborhood as a type of reconnaissance. He most likely resorted to non-violent ways to satisfy his urges with things such as porn or possibly prostitutes. Now, none of this has been confirmed. And he was somehow able to control his compulsions for a long time, long enough to have a successful and flawless military career.
And now we come to the point of the discussion. The first thing I want to point out is he came into the interview room with police wearing the same boots he had been wearing when he committed the crime. For a guy that's supposed to be so smart and he calculated everything and planned everything, to wear the same boots, that's just, to me, that just seems like a duh moment.
I don't know if it's that so much as just arrogance. I think he just thought he was going to get away with it. He probably figured they didn't have anything.
Well, I guess that's true. It just, to me, it's like, I don't know. Like I said, dumb moment. And I can't get over this man having such a successful career and a seemingly loving marriage. He was worried about his wife. He was able to make it all the way up through the ranks and become a commander and not show any signs of violence. And I don't know that maybe once he became commander of the base, that didn't have something to do with upping his stress level, which upped the need for more, I don't know, thrill or satisfaction. I wonder if that could have been what made him become a lot more violent than he had been, because there were 10 break-ins within the first 2 months of him becoming commander.
Yeah, I mean, probably so. I mean, I guess any rise in stress would do that, but he had also been holding on very tightly for years, controlling these urges with almost military-like discipline. I mean, it may have just started coming unraveled on him.
Another thing I would like to know would be about his sex life with his wife or any ex-girlfriends, because if he was doing these things, you would think, and this was never released, I haven't seen any reports on it, but you would think if he was taking these pictures of other women in sexual positions and the things he was doing, that would have somehow come out in his private life also with his wife and maybe the girlfriends.
Yeah, who knows? I mean, they probably just didn't reveal any of that because of, fear of embarrassment. But he might have had some tendencies that she thought were strange, but not, deviant.
Do you think she knew that he liked to wear women's lingerie? Or do you think he was only wearing the lingerie because it was somebody else's and that was the thrill of it?
I don't know. I mean, she may have known that because that's strange behavior to most people, but it's not in and of itself deviant if you're not taking it from someone else, the circumstances around it. So she may have been under the impression that he was a women's underwear kind of guy, which, like I said, I mean, that would seem odd to me, but maybe it seemed odd to her too, but not to the level of deviance. It'd be interesting to know if he ever wore her underwear.
That's what I was saying. I mean, do you think that he went to the point that he was wearing her underwear and she knew that, and that, hey, that's our life, that's what we do, and I'm okay with it? Or do you think he was only wearing the women's underwear that he got because that was a thrill, that was reliving him breaking into the home?
I don't know. I mean, I would think he would have a hard time repressing it to that level, but it may not do the same thing for him to wear her underwear with her consent.
So do you think his wife really had no idea that
I do.
he was going into people's houses and he had 1,400 pieces of lingerie?
I do, because if he kept that in an area of the house that she didn't frequent very much, I mean, it's all in the garage or whatever, I'm sure that there are plenty of wives that don't go poking around in the boxes under the workbench of the garage. I mean, I believe because of the amount of concern that he showed for her, that she probably didn't know. And I think it would be, although it's not impossible, we don't see a whole lot of women who aren't active participants in the crime that cover for a male counterpart who is. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
We see like co-conspirators where they're involved in the crime or they're present when the crimes take place or something like that. But we don't hear near as often of cases where the wife knows that her husband has this compulsion and she just keeps it a secret and she isn't complicit in any other way in the crimes.
Yeah. I mean, I believe her when she says she doesn't know. I was just curious as to your thoughts on that because sometimes we don't always agree.
Yeah, I don't know that there's a whole lot to disagree about on this one. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Guy's a pervert and got caught.
Yeah.
That's what it boils down to. I think he kept it secret for a long time, and I think that he was able to fill that need within him through nonviolent ways for a long time. And like we see with a lot of serial killers, it progresses. It just progressed to where nothing fed that desire other than these hyper-violent acts that resulted in the deaths of these people.
It's just a crazy case. Not that things like this haven't happened. I mean, they've happened. But when you have a high-ranking, a colonel, a commander of a base for the Canadian military, it blows your mind. Yeah,
you usually don't see people with their lives that are like put together so well, that maintain, they may hold down a job or whatever, but you don't see people that are, he's a high position of authority within the Canadian Armed Forces. He's well respected. I mean, by all outward appearances, he is winning at life. You just don't see that very much.
Well, and I think he probably also, because of his rank and the expectations of him, here he is, this big guy in the Canadian Forces, and he had this desire maybe for women's lingerie, and that would not have been looked upon in a good manner. I mean, and that's to each his own. If there's a lot of people that like to do that, but because of his position, he probably felt guilt or shame or embarrassment because he did like that and because of his position.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I mean, I don't think anybody would want their buddies knowing about it.
Well, I guess it depends on who your buddies are, but when your buddies are a bunch of military...
Especially in an environment like that, yeah, I mean, he wouldn't want that out in the military, to any of his friends or coworkers. It would certainly undermine his position, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, sad that something like that would, but...
Well, I will say this for this case. It did have an awesome interview. And I don't know that the average True Crime Out Loud listener is going to watch a 2.5 hour interview that is like grainy footage from an interview room. But this detective was on point with his interview skills, and it was very interesting from a law enforcement perspective. almost textbook of how you work a guilty subject into confessing to a crime. So I found that very interesting. And I actually have watched not the whole 10 hours, but a lot of that is compressed. He's sitting in the interview room. They're not actually talking to him, but you compress it down. There's about 2.5 hours to watch. And I have watched the whole thing, and it was very interesting.
I've watched all of it to kind of refine my interview skills. Like, okay, what did he do here? It's very good.
Sure. Well, we hope you enjoyed this week's case, and as always, we'll see you next week. We would like to hear your thoughts on this and all of our cases, and as always, you can reach us by email at truecrimeoutloud@gmail.com, Facebook and Instagram at truecrimeoutloud. Out loud is 2 words, not one, and Twitter at TCOutloud.
Photos, links, and sources for this case can be found on our website at www.truecrimeoutloud.com.